Okay, good evening, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Fralin Biomedical Research Institute at Virginia Tech Fralin Maury Strauss Distinguished Public Lecture. I want to start by expressing my really deep appreciation to Maury and the entire Strauss family for making this program possible to bring important contemporary perspectives on biomedical research, health, and healthcare to the entire community. And before I introduce today's speaker, I'm going to put in a quick plug for the next installment of the program, which will be on November 17th, when Dr. Gurpreet Dhaliwal from the University of California, San Francisco will present Becoming a Super Diagnostician, Optimizing Reasoning, Judgment, and Decision-Making. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce this evening's public lecturer, Dr. Robert Califf, the Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Califf has twice served as the Commissioner, most recently appointed by President Biden. He began his path in medicine, science, and national leadership and service at Duke University, where he received his undergraduate degree in psychology and his medical degree. And he followed it up with training in internal medicine at University of California, San Francisco, and subsequently came back to do a fellowship in cardiology at Duke. He then began his faculty positions at Duke that have now spanned almost 40 years as a professor of medicine and cardiology, followed by multiple major leadership positions there, including as the vice chancellor for clinical and translational research and health data science, and as the founding director of Duke's Translational Medicine Institute. His research and leadership contributions have been recognized with numerous honors, including election to the National Academy of Medicine, receipt of many awards from the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association, and the Alberta Heritage Foundation Medical Research Prize for Excellence in Cardiovascular Research. Prior to joining the FDA, Dr. Califf was head of medical strategy and senior advisor at Alphabet Incorporated. He's an internationally recognized expert in cardiovascular science and medicine, health outcomes research, healthcare quality, clinical research. He's led numerous transformational clinical trials, and he's also one of the most frequently cited authors in biomedical science. He's co-editor with Eric Topol of the textbook of cardiovascular medicine. His earliest research was on myocardial infarction, ventricular arrhythmias, and cardiac fibrosis. And interestingly, I found that one of his earliest articles was called The Doctor and the Computer, published over 40 years ago, where in a very prescient way, he addressed some of the opportunities and challenges along the road ahead for doctors and patients when it comes to computers and computerized digital data. Currently, Dr. Califf is leading the FDA to address challenges posed by the contamination of the global information environment by misinformation and disinformation, countering misinformation by collaborating across sectors so that decisions can be made by consumers, patients, and clinicians that are more likely to be informed by reliable information. He's recently published on the urgent need for high-quality research data on the effects of opioid use on the brain and cardiovascular health, and on how the need for well-designed prospective randomized controlled trials is still evident, even during the emergency of the pandemic, to get accurate information for patients on benefits and risks of therapies versus alternatives. As he said in one of his papers, when the answer to a clinical question is uncertain, randomize. Finally, I'll just say that in addition to his prodigious contributions in leading the FDA, Dr. Califf also seems to find some time to follow ACC basketball with a particular interest in at least one team I can think of. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rob Califf.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be with you guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, hear you fine.
Okay, let me see if I can get my slides up here. Let's see. I think this will do it. Yeah, it is that time of year again, isn't it? By the way, I may not be the most popular. Let me get rid of that one. May not be the most popular fan here since there's been some notable adventures between my team, the Duke Blue Devils, and the Virginia Tech team over the years, particularly recently. I do still have my season tickets, and although I missed the last exhibition game last night, it's going to be an interesting year with a new coach for the Blue Devils, so we'll see how that goes.
Yep.
So what I thought I'd do today is just give you a bit of a philosophy treatise about what I think is going on these days and some of the most important ways that as a translational science group in a major technology institution that you can make a difference. And the sort of bottom line is shown on this first slide. We are in this really amazing period of discovery and development. I was in a meeting night before last, getting ready for the G7 transition from UK to Japan. And we were, I think the main feeling there was technology has almost unlimited potential now. But unfortunately, although the US is without question the most creative and innovative country with regard to the development of technology, it's not paying off in terms of superior health outcomes for our population. But if we did harness the technology with the right policies and the right translational research and the right implementation, we really could usher in a new era of better health in this country. And I think it's fair to say that, as evidenced by things like the CTSA program and the many technology institutes that we have, we've got a very effective infrastructure, but now we got to really pay a lot of attention to the rest of it. So first of all, just by way of background, I find that one of the fascinating parts of being FDA commissioner, and this is my second tour of duty, so I can compare it to 2015, 2016. What we do affects almost everybody, and so almost everybody has an opinion. But I often find that people have a sketchy idea of what the FDA actually does. I keep running into people who think the FDA produces products or does the clinical trials. But of course, above all else, the FDA is a regulatory agency. But I also want to make the point that deeply embedded in the history of the FDA and the way the courts look at the decisions that FDA makes, it's a science agency where decisions are made by full-time civil servants who are by and large doing scientific evaluations, but with a major dose of public health. And I think it's pretty easy, I think, for everyone to see that in the midst of a pandemic, there's a lot of overlap between what's best for the whole population and what might be best for individuals within that population. And I think one of the real benefits that I've had, having been a practicing cardiologist and a cardiovascular researcher for many years, is really seeing how the intersection of the sort of biomedical types with the policy types and the lawyers can lead to a mix which can be highly productive. It's a critical part of the culture. So what is it that we regulate? It's between a fifth and a quarter of the economy. Food, in fact, the F in FDA does stand for food. I have spent a lot of my time, both in 2016 and this time around even more, working on the issue of food. And I don't need to tell people at Virginia Tech, I don't believe that biotechnology applied to our food supply and the food supply chain may be one of the most important aspects of what can be done in this era of global climate change and international strife and threat to the supply chains. We also regulate cosmetics, and I certainly was not an expert on cosmetics when I first did my first tour of duty. I'm not an expert now, but I have learned a lot. It's about a $60 billion industry. Just to give you an idea, the question I like to ask is, how many cosmetics does the average woman use in the United States per day? The answer is 12. But even more surprising to a lot of people, how many does the average man use? And the answer is 6. And if you think about shampoo and deodorant and all the things that we put on our skin for a whole variety of reasons, this is a big industry that probably could use an upfit in the way that it's regulated. The animal part of the FDA is the least appreciated. I know that it's a part of your institution, but the Center for Veterinary Medicine, not only is involved in the food supply, but also very importantly, drugs and devices in animals are a very important part of its work. And One Health is important to us all right now. And the ability to use computation within one institution, the FDA, to look across all the animal species and the human condition is a very important part of what we do. Drugs and devices people take for granted with regard to FDA. Don't need to tell you that the digital revolution has created a whole different era of devices now, with a lot of need for new regulations and ways to think about innovation. And the biggest area, we just had our user fees agreed to for the next 5 years. And in that is a large growth in our staff to deal with regenerative medicine, gene editing, and gene therapy, which is going to be a big part of the next 5 years of biomedical human improvement, we hope. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't specifically call out tobacco, because it's different than the other things that we regulate. Tobacco was added to our portfolio at the beginning of the Obama administration. We now have a large Center for Tobacco Products, and we'll talk a little bit more about this further on in the talk, but it's a very critical part of what we do that's somewhat different than everything else at the FDA. That's what we regulate, but what's the mission? And probably no surprise to anyone, safety or protecting the public health is the number one mission. And this issue of safety, efficacy, and security of the human and veterinary supply of all these commodities is a big part of what we do. And I would stress security right now, because the supply chain and making sure that the right products are getting to the right place is a major part of our effort during the pandemic. But right there with safety is speeding innovation. And it's this balance of how do you assure the public of safety while you're also helping the industry develop the next things that may carry risk, a real challenge in the balance that we're trying to maintain. And then you'll notice here at the back end of this long sentence, helping the public get accurate science-based information. And Mike referred to this. I'll say more about it later, but I think people underestimate how hard it is to communicate with over 300 million people speaking different languages at different levels of education and different levels of scientific and quantitative understanding. A huge challenge that we're not doing so well at right now, I don't think, and we're going to need the help of institutions like yours if we're going to make the progress that we need. And then just referring back to tobacco, it's quite an interesting and complicated industry, and I shouldn't need to tell any university campus about vaping, which is a very large part of what we're needing to work on now, with millions of teenagers becoming addicted to nicotine through vaping. And then lastly, this in 2016, when I gave this talk about our mission statement, a lot of people were mystified by this significant role in counterterrorism, but in also ensuring that we make it through deliberate and naturally emerging public health threats. And now with COVID and monkeypox and Ebola, I think people really get it. And of course, high on the list right now is nuclear threat, because we have significant accountability for countermeasures in case there is a nuclear attack on the United States or any of our people anywhere. This mandates a standing capacity, which is really put to the test when something happens. But in the interim, between pandemics and between natural disasters, there's a lot of work that has to go on to be as ready as we can be. All right, so now I'm going to go through some slides that will not be surprising to you, but I find that it's been very hard for Americans to absorb what's in these slides and to think about how to turn it into action. But my one purpose tonight is to try to impress upon you that we're in a different time now. 15 years ago, we could talk about wanting to do better, the need for translation, the suffering that occurs that's unnecessary. But we were doing it from a perspective that America's system looked like the best. But we can no longer do that when it comes to health outcomes. And I'll go through this, and hopefully will be motivating to you. It's a little depressing at first, but it's a real opportunity for people to come together and develop approaches that are more successful in translating our amazing prowess and technology into better health outcomes for our own population. So if you look at this slide, which is life expectancy for men and women, you'll notice that really if we're, this goes back to 1990, but if we went back to 1890, it's almost a steady rate of progression at a constant slope. But then around about 2010, things started to flatten out and then went down, particularly for men. So the gap between men and women is growing, but the trajectory is negative, not positive. And of course, during the pandemic, this has worsened. And this slide from the British Medical Journal, you can see that, of course, the deterioration in our life expectancy shown here are about 2 years between 2018 and 2020 before the pandemic. And then after that, it's even more. It's not uniform. We have, of course, differences according to race and ethnicity and other factors. But then if we look at what happened in 2020, and this has gone on more since then, we see a precipitous drop in life expectancy. But what's most important about this, I think, in terms of thinking about our motivation and what we need to be doing, is that if we go back to 2010, you'll see that the US life expectancy compared with other high-income countries was almost 2 years shorter. And well before the pandemic, we were losing ground compared to other high-income countries. But during the pandemic, we uniquely lost ground compared to other high-income countries. By 2020, there was a 4.5-year difference in life expectancy. And the estimates for 2022 are about a 5-year difference in life expectancy. It's also notable that this year, China passed the United States in life expectancy. It seems almost unbelievable, given the prowess we have in technology. And of course, this is not all new news. We've known now for a long time, as shown in this sort of classic slide that's been doctored on Twitter by someone who put in their opinions about why this happened. You can see that if we go to the lower left-hand corner of the slide, you'll note that the US and other high-income countries sort of were in the same place if we are plotting life expectancy versus health expenditure per capita. But then over time, the other countries migrate into the upper left-hand corner of this plot, whereas uniquely the United States is migrating to the mid right-hand side with considerably more expense for a considerably inferior outcome with regard to life expectancy. And this goes through 2018, but probably no surprise to you, this has continued to go the wrong direction for the US, so that we're now spending $4.1 trillion per year on healthcare with a dramatically inferior life expectancy, as I've just shown you. Now, not only are these differences sort of generally related to social and demographic factors, but if we put them in a geospatial axis, as shown here from work done from the University of Washington group, the slide's getting a little old. It's a 2014 depiction, but the basics of it haven't changed. And I just thought this picture was particularly effective in showing that there's a distribution to the differences in life expectancy. First, you'll notice that if we look county by county, which is what this is showing in the United States, you'll see over a 20-year difference in life expectancy across counties. And the lower life expectancy is concentrated in particular areas. I'm from South Carolina, so I share something with you. I'm not from the higher life expectancy part of the United States. And essentially, if you live on the coastal areas, your life expectancy is significantly higher on average. But within this plot, if you cone down on it, what you'd find is that university towns like the one where you live and cities, even within states that have lower life expectancy, look more like the blue areas that I'm showing here. Now, don't ask me why the demographers picked red and blue as the colors for differences in life expectancy, but it's sort of interesting the way this plays out. What should get our attention even more, I think, is that these trends are not static. And what's happening in the US is the areas that had a lower life expectancy are getting worse, and the areas with a better life expectancy are getting better over time. So these differences are being magnified. And the biggest change is occurring between the states of Oklahoma and West Virginia in this region, of which you're very much a part, and I think should be very concerning to all of us. And if we look at, this is just a representative from this one paper from University of Washington, but work done since then by multiple people has shown the same thing. No surprise to any of you, the social determinants are in the first tranche of factors that are associated with these differences in life expectancy, with race, gender, sex, ethnicity, wealth, and education being at the top of those factors. But then if you go to the second tranche, how are these differences manifested? It's common chronic diseases, obesity, diabetes, use of tobacco, high blood pressure. The good news for the healthcare profession is physician rate per 1,000 population comes in as a factor, but it's quite small compared to these other dominant factors. But it's also the case that for the physical manifestations of social determinants, there's a lot that we know that's not that expensive that we could do if we put our minds to it. So just to hammer that home in a series of 3 slides, this is a look at the leading causes of death. As a cardiologist, I don't like it too much that ischemic heart disease is still #1, but you notice that these are bread and butter chronic diseases that we know a lot about, and for which, for the most part, with some exceptions, like Alzheimer's disease, we have inexpensive generic therapies that are reasonably effective. And if we say, what are the risk factors underlying these diseases? It is really basic stuff: body mass index, glucose, blood pressure, diet, drug, and alcohol use. No big shockers here, but it is quite remarkable, as I sit atop a public health agency in Health and Human Services, to reflect on the fact that while we're leading the world in technology development, we're trailing our economic competitors in this very important health outcome metric. And then if we say what's changing the most quickly, it is drug use disorders. And just a quick word here, we're experiencing this ongoing epidemic of drug overdose. Over 100,000 Americans will lose their lives this year. The big new thing that's happening, we're making progress in reducing inappropriate prescribing of opioids, but we still have a ways to go. And you may be aware the new CDC guidelines on opioid prescribing came out today. But the new thing is that the cartels have figured out that they can chemically synthesize very high dose fentanyl and just send it through the mail. You don't need the middleman, the local sales person. It's a very economically attractive approach for illegal distribution. And it's so easy to do that we're seeing teenagers die on the first dose thinking they're getting a party drug, but it's spiked with high dose fentanyl. So something we've got to pay more attention to. And I think a theme of what I'm talking about tonight is that if we look at where we aim our technology and you look at where our biggest problems are, there's not a great match. And it's something that we are going to need to figure out. Well, I do want to rag on about tobacco a little bit, because I feel like I certainly felt in 2015 when I first came to FDA. As a cardiologist, I'd sort of taken it for granted. We had figured out about the use of tobacco. It was on the way out. We were making great progress. Didn't need to focus on it that much, but the numbers remain overwhelming. This year, we'll lose almost 500,000 people from tobacco-related illness. The estimate is at the current rate of the way things are happening, we'll lose about 6 million of today's children from premature death due to the use of tobacco. And the costs are staggering of the health effects of this problem. And of course, we've exported our expertise in tobacco globally, and it's having a devastating effect globally right now that demands all of our attention. And so while smoking cessation is not the most glorious part of biomedical research, we really have to double down on this and figure out better ways to get people unaddicted from nicotine and transitioning from tobacco products to some other habits that are healthier. And I would just say our research engine has not been focused in this place, and our clinical care engine is not paying enough attention to it. If we want to change the trajectory of death in this country, this is the thing that we could have the biggest effect in the shortest period of time if we can figure it out. And then, of course, you're located in an area which is in the middle of this, but the place, as I said, where we're seeing the fastest decline in life expectancy is in rural America. And it's a big change. If you had asked me early in my career in the 1970s, would rural people be exercising less than urban people, I would have said that's impossible, but that's in fact what's happened. And so this trend is continuing, and data since 2016 looks even worse than this, with divergence of life expectancy detrimental to rural people. Then if we look at the impact of the pandemic on all of this, the same disparities show up. And you're probably also aware that after the vaccine became available, we've seen this pretty dramatic sort of reversal where minority people were most prone to death and hospitalization from COVID before vaccination, but now with vaccine hesitancy more dominant in particularly rural white populations, we're seeing a reversal in the trends that we saw before. And the net effect of this on the US relative to other countries, as you can see here, we're at the bottom of the pack. And I got hooked on Ted Lasso. I don't know how many of you did, but I learned about relegation in Ted Lasso. And I think it's fair to say that if this were a soccer league, we would be relegated at this point to the next league down, because we're not only in last place, but we're losing ground. Well, hopefully you're depressed enough now that you're digging down deep for motivation to say, what can I do about these problems? It's an urgent matter. And when I wrote about this before coming to the FDA last year, the journal Circulation came up with this graphic to depict what I was trying to describe. We definitely got, a big disruption from COVID-19, many ripples and tsunamis coming from that. But we're sort of like the frog in the water that where the heat gets gradually turned up. We're sort of numb to the impact of common chronic disease and the death and disability which is occurring because of it. And so I believe we should be asking the question every day, what can we do to turn this negative trajectory around as a country? And of course, this is where translation comes in. This is what I grew up with in my career at Duke, starting in the first class of CTSAs and in the translational medicine arena, the idea that if we can figure out how to move more quickly and efficiently and with greater accuracy from the basic idea to the technologies and products that are effective in humans, and then translate the use of those products into effective use both in clinical practice and in the community. It's hard to argue, I think, with this depiction, but we're obviously not doing as well as peer countries in this regard. Now, I don't want to make short shrift of the fact that we still have to focus on the early phase of discovery science and the early phase of translation. We still have a situation where, with all the great research we do, all the great ideas that people have, and all the investment and people that need to be convinced to start a phase 1 human clinical trial, over 80% of drugs that get into phase 1 don't make it to market because they don't have the effect that we hope for, or there's a toxicity that was unanticipated. So we still have a lot of work to do in the early phase of translation. But I think the biggest issue now is, can we develop a system of translation out from there into defining what is effective and deploying what's effective in a better way. And at least my belief, and I've done a lot of clinical trials and observational studies in my career, somehow we developed a system which has so many impediments that it's too slow, too expensive, not reliable, doesn't answer many of the questions that matter most to patients, and it's unattractive to clinicians and administrators. So other than that, it's a great system. But we got real work to do to try to make this better. And evidence that we need to rev it up is that we're producing technologies at such a fast rate that when we look at what proportion of our major clinical practice guidelines are supported by high quality evidence, the answer is pretty low proportion. Less than 15% are supported by high quality evidence. And so we need to definitely need to make up for this gap. But I got a selfish motivation for this because one of the interesting parts of this job, and I, doing it for a second time, I knew that this was going to happen, which is why my family was opposed to my coming back into this job, is that you get heat every day as the FDA commissioner because everybody does have an opinion and your decisions, the decisions of the agency, make a difference. But it is very clear that the amount of heat generated about one of our decisions is inversely proportional to the quality of the evidence. And so in my ideal world, we'd have really good evidence for all of our decisions. There would be much less controversy and we could proceed about translation into a better health outcome situation without so much controversy. Or to put it another way, our motto is, "In God we trust, all others must bring high quality, reliable evidence." And for that to happen, we got to depend on institutions like yours to step up and make improvements that will enable the system to work better. A lot of this, I believe, has to do with the issue of evidence to practice, that the clinical outcomes are improved most when we study what we do first, we figure out what works, and then we focus implementation on the interventions that have the biggest effect and are most efficient to deploy to our populations. And this is the basis for the law that underlies the FDA with regard to drugs and devices, largely because of what happened over the years with disasters that got the attention of the public, like the thalidomide disaster, where a number of babies were born with birth defects with a drug that had not been adequately tested, and the Dalkon Shield disaster, where attempts to employ devices for birth control led to a number of bad outcomes, which led to the device regulation. And I would argue for this to work, we have to embody a translational concept to move from a system where we keep the data in one place and we have peripheral sites that do research to one which is more organized as a national network. This is not a new concept. It's not hard to envision computationally that this could happen, but I think we're still in a situation where far too often individual institutions try to do their own research, and the collaboration that would lead to adequate sized studies to provide definitive answers just don't get done. Another way of looking at this that I think is central to at least the way I think about it at FDA, we deal every day with issues that relate to patients with diseases and the clinicians who are trying to care for them. And all of the entities involved in the ecosystem talk about patient centricity. But at the center of it, I believe, really should be dominantly patients, but also, very importantly, the clinicians who help deliver the care. But unfortunately, the situation we have in the US is very disaggregated, and each of these entities has reasons to protect itself against the impact of all the other entities. And this plays out financially in the disaggregation of our finances, but it also plays out with regard to data hoarding and the lack of interoperability of information across the system. And it was really quite a shock to me. I came into the administration late because the FDA was one of the last jobs filled in the midst of the pandemic from Google. And I really was quite shocked when I realized that we had to call Israel to figure out what to do with the next dose of booster vaccine. And we relied on the UK a lot for our clinical trial results on which therapies were effective and which ones were not. With all the prowess and talent we have in the US, you would hope we could do better. And so my hope is that we'll figure out ways to work together so that these basic goals on the right-hand side of this slide are achieved in a much more efficient manner that gets the answers that patients and clinicians need to do the right thing. And by clinicians, I really mean the broad scope of doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, but also public health people who are very involved these days in issues like vaccination. And it would help if we empowered and helped advocacy groups and those who are caring for patients become more involved in the clinical research enterprise and work more in a more coordinated fashion. And maybe even equally important, the industries that are developing the products, if they were aligned with the payers to assure that not only was research getting done, but that it was efficient from the perspective of how payments are done in the system. Yesterday, at the National CTSA meeting, I heard a number of complaints about things I had hoped would have been taken care of since I've been away from it for a few years. But I learned that we still have 25-page consent forms, and we still have people who are, if they enter a research protocol, are not being covered by their insurance companies, which makes it very difficult. But I think the bright light right now is that there is no technological reason why we can't organize the information and make it available across the spectrum of all these entities instead of creating a system where the basic information is not shared and makes it so that hoarding the information actually is financially favorable to some entities. So this is a big picture of what I hope will evolve, and I hope it will be driven by those who are on the front lines, supported by the rest of the ecosystem instead of vice versa, which seems to me to be the way it's currently functioning. Now, in creating such a system, I'll go back to 2016. We published a New England Journal paper at that point, and I am pleased to say that coming back 6 years later to the government, a lot of progress has been made, and I see a lot that's in motion in a way which is going to pay off greatly in the near-term future, but we still have work to do. I won't focus on the slide, but if you read the article, you'll see a detailed depiction of the work that we thought needed to be done as of 2016. And there are basically 5 areas to focus on. This is the one I think is most important right now. If we look at why Israel and the UK have moved ahead in the clinical research arenas compared to us, it's because they've organized it so that the research is integrated into the healthcare system. When you got vaccinated in Israel, there was a record of what vaccine you got and what your outcomes were kept through electronic health records that were aggregated on a prospective basis in a way that enabled the information to be put together almost in real time. And if you had COVID in the UK, it was the job of the NHS physicians and nurses to enroll you in clinical trials that were streamlined to answer the critical questions. They were highly collaborative and depended on electronic health records for the follow-up data, so it could be done at a much lower cost. But in the US, it's been very hard for us to get organized in that way for the reasons that I've already gone over. But I do believe that if we can make it attractive for frontline clinicians to participate, as in these other countries, we will do much better. Because the data remain very strong that patients, by and large, depend on the advice they get from the clinicians that they trust, whether it be a nurse practitioner or a physician that they're seeing about whether to participate in clinical research. As part of this, I'm obviously advocating for widespread data sharing, but there's a lot of reason for people to be concerned about it. And so we've got to work on the framework we have for privacy, confidentiality, and security with our healthcare data. I think we've got it wrong right now. I can say with some authority that if it's a business, your data is pretty much out there. If it's could be used to make your health better by informing your clinicians, for example, about how other patients like you are doing or informing you. It is very difficult to get it done, and there are all sorts of hoops and hurdles. So I'm not advocating for risk-free sharing of data. What I'm advocating for is that we relook at the social contract and also the rules by which data are governed. And this is the area where I think the most progress has been made, and I can say with great confidence, EHR data was terrible 10 years ago. It's moderately bad now. It's getting better rapidly, and I think the improvement is going to be exponential. Our ability now to incorporate digital information from the home and digital laboratory information on a global basis is moving very rapidly. I think this is taken off. I'm not worried about it. I wish it was all in place now, but it's not. And then we need new methods, but I'm not at all worried about this because our universities are doing a great job with that. It's not the methods that are holding us back. It's really the hardcore operations. And we need new approaches to systems and operations. I've already talked about that. Just a couple of things here to finish up. A lot of this, as I'm saying, does depend on using data that's already being produced as a product of the healthcare system in the research enterprise. And there's been a lot of confusion about what this means. When we talk about real world evidence, we're not talking about just taking bad data that's not curated and doing a sloppy observational comparison. We're talking about a whole spectrum of methods that can be applied to data depending on the question and the circumstances that are being addressed. And there's a lot of growth in the guidance and academic productivity that's led to a better understanding of how to do this well. It's also supported by a law that was passed in 2016 called the 21st Century Cures Act, which I think has made a big difference in terms of how all this is regulated and how the methods are developed. But the key thing that I want to get across is just, we talk about real world data and real world evidence. They're related to each other, but they're not the same thing. Real world data refers to the origin of the data, where it came from. Did it come from a special research clinic, or did it come from the real world of clinical practice or someone's home? Real world evidence comes when we apply research methods to real world data that in more and more cases need to be prospective and planned in order to answer the questions that we need to be answered. and certainly do not exclude randomization. In fact, one of the most important areas of real world evidence is randomization in the real world. So it's using real world data. For example, randomization in the home done virtually will give us answers we could have never gotten before. I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time. These just make the point that if we do a good job now of using this data, we can go from a national system that right now mostly depends on passive surveillance that's not highly effective, and a research system that does one-off inefficient studies, and it's done in sort of a parallel universe, to a system where surveillance is active, much higher quality, and clinical trials, when needed, can be embedded into the healthcare system to get them done rapidly. This is a goal. I feel like we've made a lot of progress since 2016, but a ways to go. Now, my final point. All of this comes to no good if we can't communicate to people what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what actions they need to take in order to improve their own health. And I can honestly say that right now, most people that I talk with within government believe we're losing the battle on misinformation. We're not giving up. We're going to need to come up with better ways to deal with it. But for everything, for example, that the FDA puts out, there is an endless stream of misinformation, disinformation, vitriol, and statements that lead a normal person or even a normal clinical practitioner just to ask the question, what can I believe in this ocean of opinions and information? And as a community, we've got to come to grips with this. It is a priority of the Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy, but the Surgeon General can't fix this, and I don't think the federal government can fix it because there's so much mistrust of government at this point. What we need is a network of academic institutions, businesses, and federal government that's highly focused on identifying reliable, useful information and making sure that people can distinguish it. And I put this slide in, which is, I have a great slide set from the history of the FDA of real examples, but there actually were snake oil salesmen. But they were limited because they can only advertise in magazines and in local newspapers. Now, a snake oil salesman can reach billions of people overnight with one tweet. And we've got to come to grips with this very different information system that we're living in if we're going to carry the day. And I'll finish with this slide and just, the real life example that we're living right now is COVID vaccination. We're very worried the new variants are going to cause an upsurge, combined, of course, with the triple threat of respiratory syncytial virus and influenza, which is on the march now. And we have a vaccine that reduces the risk of death and hospitalization by 80%. And so far, every boost that we've given has produced another 80% reduction. And we have antivirals that are highly effective. If you look at the US population, we're losing about 300 people a day right now. Almost none of them were up to date on their vaccinations and or were treated with an antiviral early in the course. And so we have free treatments that are widely available, but because of whatever the information chains are, people are not availing themselves of these treatments, and it's persistently now the third leading cause of death in the United States. So I'll stop there. I've outlined a number of issues and approaches that I hope you all will figure out a better way to handle than I did in my career, but look forward to working with you during my time at FDA.
Thanks very much, Rob. Great lecture. I hope you're willing to take a few questions. We have some questions. So I'll read them
Sure.
out. That's okay. The first question is, let me see. You mentioned the UK and Israel in terms of collective COVID-19 information and data analysis. Both of those countries have national health systems. You also spoke about incorporating clinical studies into clinical practice. In practical terms, how can this be accomplished if third-party payers consistently refuse to support these studies and are driven by stakeholder profits? They asked this question having participated in the ACTG network and being a site PI of a CTSA group, both wonderful groups that are potential models for what you described.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the two systems are different, right? And in Israel, it's a national system, but it's really a consortium of three large HMOs in a country of a few million people. So, but what they have is an agreement that the three large HMOs share their data and use common data standards. I'm not going to make excuses for the American health insurance industry, but I will point out that the health systems and institutions in which the work gets done do have a voice. And if this was a priority, it would make a difference. And I'll also point out that this goes way back for me, but early in my career in the Clinton administration, the first things I did with what was then the Institute of Medicine was in the last days of the Clinton administration. There was a national proclamation that coverage of routine care costs in clinical trials was essentially a right. And that's held up over time, but it slips. I've noticed every few years we slip back in a major way. And I think we've got to amass the troops, if you will, to make sure that we change this in the right direction. We can argue about a national health system. Personally, I'm more inclined that way than I guess the average American would be. But we've got to make the American system work. We just have to do it because, I've shown you the data. We're going the wrong direction.
All right, thank you. One of our cardiovascular researchers, Jess Flager, said, he asked the question, you've talked about organizing and sharing data in the US. Are there plans to organize and facilitate global data sharing?
I'd say at different levels, yes. If you talk about raw data sharing, we do get into a number of issues, but if you talk about sharing results or federated data, I think that's moving along fairly rapidly. And I think you can expect to see, particularly between the US and the EU and the UK, that these areas will move along relatively quickly. It's interesting, we all have our own peculiarities. The EU proclamation about privacy has caused a number of problems with sharing data even within the EU. That's why I emphasize one of the things I think we need to put on our list, particularly universities like yours with a number of schools and departments, the ethics of data sharing. I think we really need to work on retooling that. I probably don't need to tell you that having worked at Google, sharing data in the cloud is like a trivial technical issue. It's really the cultural issues that we have to solve.
All right, thank you. One of our neuroscience researchers, Anthony Lamonte, said, one issue for the sort of information network you imagine is the magnitude of data storage, its management and cost. Would you envision this as a national infrastructure effort, or will it devolve as a mandate onto the institutions that are doing the research?
Well, I can only comment about what I believe here. And I'll just start with this. Google currently uses 4% of its server capacity. Okay, so data storage in a technical sense is just not an issue. And what we have, because of the way we configured our institutions and views of on-prem and cloud-based data storage, is, we got things to work out. But I'm very confident that we'll end up with some that is, storage is not going to be the issue. The issue is going to be who pays for their space in the cloud and what's a fair cost to share among the people that need to share. And I do think that as more and more people see and understand this, that there will be a lot of pressure to develop a national system because it needs to be fair and not borne by some at the expense of others. But it was liberating to live in the Google computational world because there was just no limit on, I had left Duke University, which is a pretty wealthy place, but you still had to worry about paying for storage to go to a place where, it just never came up as a topic.
Thanks. The director of our Behavioral Health Research Center, Addiction Research Center, Warren Bickle, says, given the increase in poor health behaviors resulting in excess mortality, you think we'll need more than new medications to address these behaviors?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I mean, I don't think the answer is totally in medications, but I think it's an area where we haven't. If you compare the oncology branch of the FDA to the psychiatric or neuropsychiatric branch of the FDA, it's night and day in terms of the activity and the exploitation of biology for human benefit. So it is something that I'm focused on. There's a fair, legitimate argument to go on that, well, oncology is just different because we do have a better understanding of the molecular basis of the disease, whereas behavioral issues are very complicated and not very well understood, including neuropsychiatric or pure neurological diseases. But I'd also point out that it was almost 50 years ago that we started the War on Cancer, as it was called. And there were enormous investments over decades where people said, oh, this is not working. It'll never pay off. And then the Human Genome Project hits and, personalized cancer therapy is now something that we just take for granted. So the short answer is yes, we need more drugs. I'd also point out this is an area where digital health is got to be a huge part of it because we can reach people wherever they are. Now that we've allocated the money for internet everywhere in the U.S., it'll take a while for the states to deploy it, but the money is there. We should be able to interact with people in terms of the behavioral counseling and other behavioral methods should get much better. So we are going to invest in trying to integrate this across the FDA at the basic level.
Okay. All right, I'll do just two more quick short questions. We'll hit the end of the time. One from one of our trainees. Does the FDA actively research dissemination and implementation science? Do you know of any dissemination implementation frameworks that are being utilized to answer these questions?
The FDA has almost no research budget. I mean, it's a regulatory agency that has a public health mission. We have a lot of smart people. They do some research. There are some areas like in vaccines where the FDA has to do research to inform the industry about certain things that the industry wouldn't normally do. But I would turn, to NIH, AHRQ, PCORI as the main funding agencies for implementation and dissemination research. My whole lecture pointed out that it's easy for me to point to those other organizations, but we're not doing well right now. So it's an area that needs more emphasis. There is a project that I'm very excited about. We'll see how it turns out, but there's going to be a common fund NIH project on scientific communication. And I am convinced that if we turn loose money like we did for cancer at a much lower level to our academic places where a lot of smart people are, we'll come up with some better ways to combat misinformation and get reliable scientific information out.
Great. Okay, I'll take one. I'm going to read one last question here. It's from one of our community members. Really follows on to what you just said, but they ask, what can a regular, non-medical, non-scientific, healthy person do to help address these issues?
That is such a great question because one great thing about being the FDA commissioner is about 99% of the calls I make get returned. I mean, people call me back. And so I've called everybody I know who's an expert on misinformation. And none of them have a solution to the problem that they think will work across the board, but they all agree that the most effective way to combat misinformation is through a human interaction with a person that you know and trust. And that's why I think this dissemination into primary care practices, community colleges, churches, routine interactions is so important. So what I would say to a person who's motivated is get involved with your local healthcare community. If you're near a university like a Virginia Tech, you're lucky, get involved. But then don't be shy. Once you're involved, go out and talk to your friends and neighbors and be an advocate for depending on reliable information and dispelling. I don't know else to describe it. It's been said and it's been documented now. If you tell a lie over and over and over, a significant proportion of the population will begin to believe it's true. And the only way to overcome that is to be persistent in overcoming it. And again, if it were just about fantasy world, that would be fine, but people are dying unnecessarily because they're being misled about basic things that we know are scientifically true.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rob. There are a number of comments here that I have saying great lecture, fantastic, thank you, and so forth. And I'll just reiterate that and say thank you very much for a very informative and entertaining and interesting lecture.
Well, I wish you guys good luck in the ACC basketball, except for a couple of games where I hope you lose.
Thanks so much for your time, Rob.
All right, take care.